I'm going to try. I also spend a lot of time on Zoom, but I'm not as savvy as Pastor Jill. So bear with me as I try to get the screen up. And no comments about my desktop are allowed, because you'll see it. Oh, no, you didn't. Okay. All right, I am sharing that. Okay, we'll start that. Just a little bit about this training. We're going to go over the role and the responsibilities of the congregational disaster coordinator. In our Synod disaster plan, we have a number of ways that people serve. And one of them is to be a Synod volunteer disaster response coordinator. And that role essentially encompasses a geographic area and multiple congregations and has more expanded responsibilities within the disaster plan. This is particular to your congregation and your community. And so we're really excited that you stepped up for your congregation to serve in this way. This really makes it happen. A number of you on this training this morning have been active in disaster response. The folks from Loudoun responded after tornadoes. I know that. Also after the fires and sending resources. Kingsport, also, in Columbus, Georgia, after the tornadoes went through in Lee County, Alabama. Y'all were there to be supportive as well. So all of us around the Synod, all the congregations have a role to play, and you're to help them in that process. We'll go over that. Also, to be involved in disaster response is like learning a whole new language. There are so many different pieces to it, and it has its own life cycle and its own way of doing things. There's nothing normal in a disaster. So we'll go over some Disaster 101 just to get a sense of some of the things that are pretty predictable within a disaster, if you can even say those words, but things you can anticipate. Then we will talk about congregational preparedness. Now that is extremely important, and it's a process that begins that you will shepherd in your congregation, and a very critical piece of helping your congregation be ready and also respond. And then, of course, in how we can, as congregations, serve in the midst of a disaster. There are challenges, as you all know, but we come as people of abundance and of resource and of gifts, and how we live them out into our communities after a disaster is both a privilege, an honor, and a blessing. And then we will talk about the disaster pandemic COVID-19, because COVID-19 pandemic is a disaster. And I sent some resources out already, so you'll have those, but I'll give you a list of others that you have them on your slide sheet, that you can continue your learning. Just a little introduction about who we are in the Synod and how we approach disaster ministry. The Synod is a bunch of congregations. Is it 164, Pastor Jill? I forget the number. It's a bunch.
It's about around we say around 160, because some are mission churches, they aren't all organized, but about 160.
Okay. So we are a bunch of churches as one body within a synod. We have each of us serve as the body of Christ within our own communities, and together we serve in the larger sense in the larger church. We share our ministry together, and we have within our synod, we have the support, as Pastor Jill said, she is the liaison. This is disaster ministry as part of her portfolio. We are anchored into the synod structure that way, and we are a committee within the synod, and we have representatives from each of the states that participate, plus other advisors that have experience or expertise or in disaster ministry. The Synod Disaster Ministry Committee also has, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the volunteer disaster response coordinators in different parts of the Synod. We don't have them everywhere, but we do have a number of them that lend their expertise after a disaster and try to help get the Synod prepared. And now we will have y'all to add to that mix of sharing the responsibilities of being disaster ministry in the Synod. As I mentioned, Synod office and staff, they have roles to play within a disaster. They are essentially an essential communication hub and coordinating hub after an event and just prior to an event to make sure we get rolling, and also the funding gets coming and the emotional, spiritual support and resources start flowing. Another partner that we have is Inspiritus, especially for those of you in Georgia and in Tennessee. You know, Inspiritus is our social ministry organization that does phenomenal work within the area of disaster response. Sherry Burrish, who is their Inspiritus's disaster response director or coordinator, is incredibly gifted, experienced disaster leader within the internationally. I mean, she is just that good. And so she has been ramping up relief teams that are first on the ground in places where they are dispatched to go, and also are active in long-term recovery. So we see them working right now and standing up on a response in Cookeville after the tornadoes we have had there in Tennessee. So they are one of our partners. Lutheran Disaster Response, not just, you know, all of us on this Zoom are Lutheran Disaster Response, but Lutheran Disaster Response at the church-wide level are also our partners. They provide funding for us to do disaster ministry in our communities. We could not do the extent of the work that we do without their support. They are currently funding construction coordinators and support of a case manager in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where we continue and have been responding there for the last, oh goodness, 5 years after floods and tornadoes and floods and tornadoes. So we have all these partners plus many disaster relief and response partners that are from other faith traditions. So we share that ministry. We do not do this all alone. So rest assured that as you face a situation, should you be in a situation of a disaster, you will have partners, and there are others to come and walk beside you and support you in this ministry. And we're all a work in process. So keep that in mind too. Grace is important. Forgiveness is important in this ministry. Now, to talk a little bit about the role of the disaster coordinator. A congregational disaster coordinator is a key position to receive and disseminate any of the information from the Synod or from the Disaster Ministry Committee or from Lutheran Disaster Response into the congregation and to your council or to those to help get that information put into place. So you would receive information from Pastor Jill or from Pastor Katie, and it would be up to you to share that information widely as you prepare and educate your members in your congregation. Also, to assist the pastor to convey any of the needs that you see in your community or within your congregation back to the Synod or to the Disaster Ministry Committee. So that would be really important as well. So you see yourself as a communication conduit there. And then you help, this is a biggie, you help your congregation form a plan and implement it in the event of a disaster. So this is a good piece of our training today, is how to do that. So entering into a time of disaster, I know that many of you have already experienced disasters and have participated in responding to disasters. But when you think about a disaster, you think about things like that box that Jill just unpacked. Everything is everywhere. It is disorder. It is dysfunction. It is brokenness. It is shifting sand. It is just nothing as normal, nothing as usual. Disasters, understanding how a disaster lives out and how people are impacted is important as you look at planning for one. It helps you anticipate what you might need to do. And also it might help you not be totally overwhelmed when you're in the midst of it. I can remember responding after Hurricane Katrina and drawing as heavily as I could from a prior experience and learning that I had from Hurricane George before that. I had a sense of how the life cycle lived out in a disaster. I knew that we could be pulled through that and would be pulled through that. But had I not had that experience in the past, I think all I would have been able to see was the carnage. So knowing and understanding and then teaching those in your community, in your congregation, helping them understand how a disaster lives out is really important, because it helps them deal with their anxiety in a disaster. So I'm going to go right here. A disaster is anything that overwhelms a community's capacity to respond. You're going to need outside help. You're going to need something beyond your sphere to stabilize you, to bring you essential needs. So an individual's home catches fire. That is a disaster for that family. You need the community around you to come in and put out the fire and to help you find shelter and help you get the essential needs to attend to you. You do not have the capacity to do that yourself in that event. Just like with a tornado often will hit a more, I don't want to say isolated, but they have a more surgical approach. They, you can see a 34-mile stretch through Louisville, Mississippi where tornadoes went through, and you could see homes standing just fine and then just laid waste in the rest of the path. The places that are functional come in to support those that are not. So a disaster is anything that can overwhelm the capacity to respond. And we are certainly experiencing that with COVID-19, and we'll talk more about that. It can be natural, like the hurricanes, the tornadoes, earthquakes, fires that are lightning strikes. These kind of things are considered natural disasters. They can be biological, and that is what we're seeing with pandemic. They can be social or human caused. We certainly have seen those in horrific mass shootings, in the bombings, in 9/11. We know those disasters. Or they can be industrial or technological, like the industrial disaster that occurred in Savannah at the docks. So you have all sorts of disasters, and it's important for you to know what type of disasters your congregation, your community is most prone to, so that you can educate and prepare for that. Now, you can't be sure because so many of these are everywhere. As Pastor Jill said, didn't expect a hurricane up in Atlanta, but yet you still have that. We have ice storms that cause disasters. So Mother Nature is certainly showing us some creativity in what can be a disaster these days. So, this is the disaster emergency cycle. You have probably seen something like this in the past. It is, you'll see a number of takes on the very same thing. And in the Congregational Preparedness Guide, that the PDF that I sent out, there's some beautiful slides in there, or graphs in there, that show this in a couple of different ways. So I would encourage you to look over those after the course. I will say, just like the cycle of grief, some of these things are not necessarily always linear. And for instance, mitigation. Mitigation is anything that you do to lessen the impact of the incident or proposed incident, or an incident you're preparing to eventually experience. So you will see that occurring often through relief, and also through recovery, and of course as part of preparedness. And we'll talk more about how that works. So for the instance with the hurricane, we have opportunities to prepare a little. We have a little bit of knowledge, just like we're watching those two more waves out there that are scrolling toward us at this time. So we're watching those, and you're preparing, you're thinking about, perhaps you're thinking about what didn't stay tied down during Laura, how I can tie that down better. That's mitigation. But perhaps it's updating and making sure your insurance is not lapsed, or that it covers everything it's supposed to cover, or that everybody's phone numbers are up to date. So you're doing that preparedness work, getting ready for an impact. Now, when an incident or an impact occurs, then it's basic safety. That's where you're concerned. And that's, after that, of course, is rescue. Then we move into the response, the relief phase. And you're familiar with the relief phase. And the relief phase follows then recovery. Once you begin to take care of your basic needs, then you are able to start responding to the more, the less critical needs that are not life preserving. And you move into recovering a property and establishing a new normal. That rule of 10 refers to the amount of time you spend in relief. You can multiply that by 10 and anticipate that many weeks of intermediate recovery, and then multiply by 10 and look at long-term phase, just to kind of give you a sense of how long it lasts. Now this cycle, as you see, some disasters like tornadoes, depending on the scope and how much damage is done, you may be able to recover if the community has adequate resources within a few years. Or if it's a huge disaster or catastrophic disaster like Harvey or like Katrina or like Sandy was, you may be looking at up to 10 years of recovery time to help move forward. During the rescue phase, that is, of course, where you have EMS and first responders out. This is not a time we have volunteers out. This is a time where only those who have some clearance and some skills that are needed, like our chainsaw crews, will be out there. John Bettner is part of a chainsaw crew that is deployed just about after every disaster to clear the roads and to make way for essential responders to get through to do rescue. So this is during rescue phase. Congregational disaster ministry is essentially checking in on their family members and checking in on the members of their congregation and just trying to touch base to say, are you okay? And then if there are emergent needs, trying to refer them or to get them some way to receive that. But this is generally a time where we're not deploying volunteers during rescue. And that's usually the first 72 hours, maybe less, and sometimes longer, just depending on the size of the scope. And relief is one that we are very familiar with in our synod. After a disaster occurs, the church has been a haven for people in your community. So people know if you've had a food pantry and before a disaster, folks are going to come to your food pantry after your disaster because they know you have been a place of help. Also, your congregation may be one of the few buildings that has room for disaster operations to work out of. And when that happens, your congregation has to decide whether they're going to serve in that way. On the upper left-hand slide, you see an old picture from Hurricane Katrina, and that's Christus Victor Lutheran Church's parish hall. And it served as a distribution center for olive for years. It was pretty impressive. And the lower left is where they were distributing water out of the parking lot. So you could be a warehouse, you could be a feeding site, number of different things you can do in relief. Now, recovery is when you start putting things back together. And of course, we have these couple of different things that happen during recovery that we have pictures, all of our members here. These are all Southeastern Synod folks. The upper left-hand picture is in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where a team are working to rebuild a home and working with our construction coordinator, Daryl. And then another way is to also provide for the emotional spiritual care. And later I would hope that we can get Pastor Stacy to talk a little bit more about that um, um, as we go along. So there are things that occur in these different phases that congregations are uniquely gifted and skilled and to do. So that's a question for each congregation to think about and to determine how would I like as a congregation, how would we like as a congregation to serve our community? Now, there are a lot of people, a lot of actors in disaster response, and you will see them after a disaster, and it will be confusing as all get out because there are so many and there are so many acronyms. You have FEMA that comes in, but FEMA won't come in until probably 3 or 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, maybe a week after the disaster hits. Right after a disaster, your first folks you see on the ground generally are your rescue folks and the American Red Cross, Salvation Army. These organizations are your early responders. Then you have your disaster response agencies within your government, your civic government. So you have a city disaster planner, and you have an emergency operations system that's set up within your city and in your county, and they coordinate all of these different agencies together. So there is really a plan of coordination. You just have to tap into it to get the information. But know that that is and is existing right now within your communities. So it usually is through your EMS, and then your mayor will be involved, and then they relate to the statewide disaster planning part. And any kind of funding that we get into a community that comes from the state or the federal government comes through these entities. So just know that that is a piece that's in play as well. And it relates to FEMA. So FEMA's drawing information from the disaster. You have local people, local EMS that are drawing information from a disaster, and all of this comes together, and the governor then can request a declaration, a disaster declaration, and that will allow extra funds to come into your community or your state to respond to a disaster. So all those things happen like in the first couple of weeks after a disaster, you have all this activity. So if people say nobody knows what's happening, it's because those pieces haven't quite fallen into place just yet. They are falling into place, but they're just not there yet. And it's hard to wait in those times. The disaster response agencies at the state and the city level, they're the ones that connect with the funding to have debris removal taken care of. That all of those type of big activities come through that venue. Now you also have all these different religious and civic groups and nonprofit organizations that are also at play. And I'll show you a list of a whole bunch of them in just a minute. But these are folks who are coming together from the community that are trying to help people respond and to recover. So the coordinating of our efforts is, what do we need to do in that situation? And that's a process of assessment. Where Lutheran Disaster Response has committed its resources in a community is to address the least of these, those whose needs are the greatest and that are where the resources are most limited, where there's limited insurance, where they are really not going to be able to recover on their own. And we go through a process to assess that with intake and case management, but we usually build our plan around trying to support those who are going to be left out of this recovery. So with all these different organizations and systems in play, hopefully we are able to address the majority of folks who've been impacted by the disaster. But it's messy, and especially messy now because with COVID-19, volunteers are, almost not there. And it is hugely volunteer driven. And also the resources, the financial resources are extremely great. So, it is complicated. And I put this all out there so that yep, you're not crazy when you engage that and say, this is just not making sense. Well, it doesn't until you've encountered them for time and time. This is a partial list of the faith-based groups that come together after a disaster. These are VOAD members. Lutheran Disaster Response is part of that. We're part of that. And a VOAD is a voluntary organizations active in disasters. These are people that keep a continued association over time so that we can learn to plan and work together in disaster, building on each other's strengths and gifts. It's not uncommon after a disaster if, say, as happened in Mississippi, they said, okay, UMCOR, the Methodists are taking over in this area and doing a great job, but we need help here. Can the Lutherans go here and do this? So we work together to try to fill holes. And so you may see these people and these organizations. You may certainly see the t-shirts of folks. All hands volunteers. They are very active right after a disaster and also during long-term recovery, but you see them a lot in the early organizing phase after a disaster. Now, as I promised, we were going to take a 10-minute break every hour, and I violated that promise already once. So I've taken just a few minutes over, so I'm going to stop here, and then we'll come back to phases of a disaster. So let's take a 10-minute break, and everybody get up and move around. And like Pastor Jill said, if you had questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get to that at the end of it. Well, that'll be a good way to rehash. I know that I talk pretty fast, but I just want you to know that our presentation is much based and from the Congregational Disaster Preparedness Guide from Lutheran Disaster. We used our disaster plan as part of their resources to develop this guide. So it is a combined work from disaster coordinators and disaster responders across the ELCA that put that guide. So it's a good resource, and it's a recent resource too. That was put out, I guess, 2 years ago now, but you now have a PDF of it. And so you can take that back and just study at your own pace, and it'll be a good resource for you. I'm going to share my screen again, and let's see, there it is, share. This, for me, and one of the most important charts or images that you could know in working in disaster. This talks about the emotional impact of a disaster. And this is the basic graph in the manual that was talking about. Another image of this that has additional information on it, which is also helpful. But as you see, if you think about the emotional life cycle of a disaster, you go through some stuff. Pre-disaster, threat and warning time, you're getting anxious. You have this concern, something's coming. So you have that piece to play with. Now in a tornado, that time frame is very limited, but nowadays you have a little bit more time with the advanced warning systems, but not much. But during that pre-disaster time, there's a heightened anxiety. And then when there's impact, of course, that's your flight or fright time. That is an extreme impact in psychic-wise. But what you see after a disaster sometimes is you see that once the person has realized, okay, I'm alive, I have survived this, you have a number of different reactions. This is where you see the heroic folks, where people have strength they never thought they would have. They can work 7 days, 24 hours a day, because they're working hard to address a disaster that has just impacted them, but they are running on an adrenaline rush. And where people can injure themselves and hurt others because they're trying so hard to help and a disaster. And it's also, as you see that peak, I don't want to say euphoric, but that peak time that we see, they call the honeymoon time. Look at this community coming together, how much they love each other. This is the way it should always be. You know, there's this surge of concern for one another, and wonderful thing when you see that and experience that. You see the best that community can be. But after a while, the adrenaline runs out, and the awareness that this disaster is going to take a lot longer to clean up to recover from. And there are more complications and more losses, then to sink. They start to get disillusioned in with the systems that are supposed to help. They aren't sure how this is going to work out, and they are going through the grief. It is during this time you have increased anger and frustration, disruptions in relationships. You have divorces and separations. You have incluside. You have increases in domestic abuse and child abuse. It's during this downhill swing when things are just not working out, and they are in the throes of the worst of grief. And they go through that until they begin to come to terms with that grief. And that takes some time. During this disillusionment time in a congregation, you may have people come in and just say anything and everything. People who in your congregation may be angry over things you would never have thought they would be angry about. You know, simple things, little things. So it's important for you as a disaster coordinator. This is normal behavior, that they are just grieving, and there is no solid ground under them yet. They are still in free fall in this grief. Otherwise, you know, our tendency is just to react to them and their response. So to understand, you know, where they are in the emotional life cycle of a disaster is important. But once they begin to come to terms, they start working their way back up to some strength. In disaster response, we work with families to prepare a disaster recovery plan. We don't do that for them. We work with them because we want their strength to be empowered and their personal agency to be strengthened as they get back to a new beginning. But as they begin to work through recovering and seeing that they have strength and they're building on that strength, things can still trigger that grief, trigger that same experience they had right after a disaster or the disaster itself. Anniversaries. Today is the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. I don't forget that. People on the coast with Hurricane coming in. I bet they thought about Katrina. You know, there are things that...
Pastor Morgan, you're buffering, your audio is buffering, at least it is for me. If you turn off your video, that might help us to be able to hear you better. Or did we lose her completely? John, I might have to punt to you. Let me text her. I think we lost her and she'll be right back. Can we answer any questions up to this point that maybe John or I or Pastor Morgan's coming back? There she is.
Sorry, y'all. I don't know where I left off.
We're talking about the anniversary of Katrina, and the people along the coast won't forget that. If you're having problems with your connection, if you turn off your video, it might help the audio.
Okay. Okay. Let me do that.
You sound a lot better now, so I don't know whether it was just a connection time, but
Yeah. Sorry about that. That is one thing that I'm concerned about with always doing a webinar. But if y'all are patient and grace and forgiving, I think we'll proceed on. So these anniversary times are, you can, once you've gone through a disaster, know that you're going to remember it. And if your congregation's been largely impacted by a disaster or your community, anticipate grief reactions over those times and be gentle with one another. So I just can't encourage you enough to keep this graft in mind.
I think you're back.
So, being a ready church, disaster and preparedness, that's what brings us to resiliency. So I am going to, part about being a ready church is making sure that you can accompany the members in your congregation and your congregation in its community to get ready for a disaster and to respond to one. I'm going to turn this over to John now. And John, if you will just let me know when you want me to move a slide forward, I'll do it.
Thank you. Being a ready church is sometimes something that you don't particularly anticipate. And Morgan, I'm going to use Crispus Victor as an inspirational touch point among several others. The first trip I made to Katrina relief, which was 15 years ago. I don't know if you planned this date for this training, but it's certainly apropos. Crispus Victor, we stayed at Crispus Victor and provided a work crew and also provided service that Sunday morning. And when we went, it was incredibly inspirational because the church had watermarks 4 or 5 feet up on the wall. The carpet was all out of the sanctuary. There was a nurse's office in the narthex and the food pantry, which you saw in the pictures, and the drive-through distribution points. And that is, to me, the epitome of Christian response to a disaster. And it's tough. It's hard on churches. They I'm sure wanted to get their own stuff done. They wanted to get their cleanup started, but the first call that they made was to be a beacon to their community. And to me, that is why we want to be a ready church, why we want to respond the way Christ would have us do it. And sometimes it means sacrifice some of your own things for a while. But it was an inspiration for me, and I'm sure many other volunteers that came through there in the months and actually years afterwards. Go ahead and turn the slide there. So, what does it mean to be a ready church? And how do you get ready? What is your vision? One of the reasons, to me, there are 3 reasons for being a ready church and having a disaster plan. The first one is actually team building. If you're lucky enough to pull together members of your congregation to help with this plan, it's an opportunity to get to know them, assess the strength of other members of your church. And there'll be some time together. It's fellowship, maybe not the right word, but it's certainly team building, and it's an opportunity to get to know other members of your church. The second reason that you do a preparedness plan, of course, is like your home plan, is what are you going to do to prepare both your church physical property your financial property, all the things that could be damaged in, say, a flood or a hurricane or a tornado. And then the third reason to do that, besides preparing for your own personal and your own congregation, is what can we do to be of value to our community following a disaster where we're perhaps not as damaged or as exposed as other areas around us? What can we do? Can we be a dispensary? Can we be a Wi-Fi charging station? Can we house volunteers? And so as you go through your plan, it also gives you an opportunity to assess what your church can offer to others. So here's some steps on being your, what to look for and how to address your plan and what to do. What is your vision and scope? Do you want to do nuts and bolts down to where the utility shutoffs are, or do you want to be a little bit more general and have others that follow in with that? Are you going to develop teams that you can send out on mission groups and be prepared in response and teach others? That is the job now that we are hoping to teach the congregational coordinators to do. And then the actual physical steps that we'll show you for being prepared, the response to the threat and the impact of a disaster. And we'll talk about some of the potential disasters that may be more pertinent to your particular situation. The approval of the plan gives you congregation and council buy-in. It doesn't do any good to have 1 or 6 members of a congregation come up with a plan and then just have it sit on a shelf if it hasn't been presented to your congregation, if you haven't made the appeal that this is something as a Christian community we can offer. And then education, practice, review, things will change. COVID-19 has thrown many plans, if not out the window, it certainly made churches reassess and disaster responders reassess how we're going to do things. And then continuing, following that, adjustment and refinement of the plan. Okay, Morgan. So this is a list of some of the tasks that your team is called to do. Develop a purpose, vision, and goals. This can be as simple as prepare the building and assess what our congregation can offer to the community, or you can refine it more. This is kind of individual. Find members. It's important that it's not the one guy from property who knows where everything is to do it. If you designate enough members and get buy-in again from your church, one, if Joe, the property guy who knows where all the switches and levers are, is out, you got to have a backup. That's going to be more pertinent to your church than preparing for a flood for eventuality that may never happen. Inventory your assets. In the day of cell phone cameras, this is much easier to do than it was years ago. Roving inventory of a video of your sanctuary, your sacrament items, if you have silver communion elements, for example, and then your technology. Your computer systems, your backups. What are you vulnerable to? Do you sit in the low area? Are you by a railroad track? Are you in a part of town where you have to monitor comings and going of people in and out of your door? And then we talk about identifying partners, agreements, and resources. Suppose your church is unable to worship in person, not for COVID, but due to damage to the building. Where can you continue your ministries and meet? Have you met with a nearby school that you can use their cafeteria? Can you go at 5 o'clock to another church and use their sanctuary after hours when they do their service? Things of these natures. If you do them ahead of time, you can flow right into them easily instead of trying to make everything up when everybody is on edge and suffering from the same things that you are. Communication plan, your emergency operations, these all continuity of ministry, these all flow from being prepared for what you can do ahead of time so that you're ready to go. Again, like we talked about in the earlier slides, congregational approval, this is buy-in. This is something that they're all involved. And then that's part of it. Perhaps you do a Sunday school class, or when we get back on a Wednesday evening for Lent or Advent where you're looking for some program-based things, review your plan, review all this with your congregation in small groups. And go deeper and refine. You'll find things that you've missed if you go to trainings like this or other training, or if you become active in your VOAD group, there's going to be things that you've missed and didn't think of, and somebody's already done it. So there are ways to keep your plan current. Okay, Morgan. Who do you put on this team? If you have an idea, if your church is big enough and varied enough, can you get a medical professional or a nurse to help you decide at some point if you have to be a clinic or emergency response, or even if you have things like a blood drive that they can help you with the sanitation issues that are required. First responders are obvious. The property committee needs to be intimately involved, I think, in the preparedness for your church for a disaster, in that they know how things work. They know where the shutoffs are. They know how to fire up the temperamental air conditioning unit, things of that nature. Also, somebody who may have contact with sheriff's departments, fire departments, so that if something happens, they can point them out to the right things quickly. And then your finances will be disturbed if you have a disaster. One, just, do you know what your budget is? I mean, we're coming up towards budget season. Somebody who understands that, how your backup is done. Used to be, we'd tell people to back things up on a disk and take them home. With cloud backup now, that's really a lot simpler, but you need to have a documented program or a documented procedure so people know how to access that if your primary computer is damaged. And then somebody that's engaged with the ministries, how do you connect with shut-ins or people that need extra attention in the event of we can't all gather on a Sunday? Okay, Morgan. So some of these goals we've already kind of talked about, but the idea is to protect our assets. The building is going to be the greatest physical asset that most churches and congregations have. And like your house, that's where you meet. That's where you have to be. So simple steps that will help prevent that will go a long way. And then how do you look after the members of your congregation that are shut-ins, elderly, less fortunate, in the event of their already tenuous connections to the church are disrupted even more. And the question on everybody's mind now, how do we return to normal when things happen? If we have a program and a preparedness plan in place to reach out to our shut-ins and our impacted members, it saves reinventing the wheel when everybody's under stress and under pressure. And our church community is not just our members, it's the people around our community, around our building, your neighborhood. As Morgan mentioned earlier, if you're a food bank already and things go south, you're going to be one even more so. So are you ready to gear that up? Can you rearrange your fellowship hall to provide a larger pantry area, things of that nature? And then it doesn't do any good to have your church prepared if you haven't prepared your people. One of the things I've enjoyed about being a preparedness coordinator for the Synod is getting out to churches and other activities and actually helping people come up with their own individual plans. Most of you are interested in this already and probably have done that, but even from a family level, do you have a place where you meet if your house is destroyed? Do you have a way to communicate and gather your family back together in the event of a area-wide disaster? So there are ways. What do you put in your go bag? What do you put in your tub if you're in a tornado area where you have to shelter in place? What do you do to prepare your family? So this is one of the fun parts of this job is to give these presentations. And so, as we talked about earlier, the new normal, how do we establish Sunday worship and how do we get the office up and running again? Okay, Morgan. So there are several roles here. And the idea is not to just draw a line and say pastor, 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 and me. Again, as you bring in more members of your congregation onto this team, it spreads some of the responsibilities out. And if there is a disaster, your pastor is already going to be on overload. Obviously, most likely they're going to be the chief decision maker. But who's going to back up your pastor? Who's going to help with some of the decisions that may not need to be his or her responsibility? In this day and age, who's going to speak to the media, or who runs your Facebook or social media page? Social media is certainly overshown community newspapers and local TV as far as how to get information out quickly and how to reach most of the people on your contact list quickly. Who's in charge of your Facebook page? Can they do it remotely? Do you have several people that are administrators to it so that this can be done? And then legal and insurance, anytime that there are things damaged or destroyed, all sorts of issues come into play. So those type of liaisons are very, very important. Okay. Other team roles are first aid, essential supplies, utilities we talked about with the property people, internal communication within a congregation. One of the things that we've developed in our plan is who's in charge of making sure your fire extinguishers are certified and up to date, and emergency lights. Things of that nature are all part of your emergency planning that aren't a very sexy or a very exciting job, but are essential to continue the operation of the church when things do go bad. Again, who would talk with the congregation? If it's a small church so common that we have here in the South, it can't just be the pastor. So as you can see here, I don't like to just read all the slides, so you can kind of follow up on some of these other suggestions. But it's getting to know your congregation and who can do what and who is interested in continuing these ministries. Okay. So part of the process is what's going to happen? What's our risk assessment? If you're 500 miles inland from a hurricane, floodwaters and storm surge are probably not an issue, but secondary tornadoes and wind damage may be. And this is going to vary by your area, what you're by, what your community's like. And there's some tools that they help you walk through: probability, magnitude, warning, duration. So one of the things we can do here in this part of the session is as we've got a variety of people from areas of the Synod, what are some of the things that you can bring up in your congregation that might be a risk that won't be for somebody else? In Alabama, we have in Anniston, we have the Anniston Army Depot, which for up until just a couple of years ago was decommissioning missile heads. Get an accident there, that's going to be a much different risk than a natural disaster with a tornado, for example. Railroad crossings where you have chemical railroad cars go by, it's going to be a risk that needs to be assessed. Other risk, if people want to bring it, you know, Morgan, do we have a way to share this or bring people back on to talk about this?
So you can just unmute, and if you have something that you want to share for your particular area, I think that's what John's looking for at this point. Or if you raise your hand, I can wave. I can call on you.
Yeah, what I'm looking for is some examples of things that may be area specific that not everybody would see. That maybe will jog something in somebody's mind to put this on their risk assessment.
For our area, we have a small, well, it's not small, but we have a regional airport nearby. And so I know that we've, in the past, there's been issues with, planes that have had to have emergency landings. And we've been lucky that we've never had anyone not make it to the airport. But, that would be something that potentially could be around our place.
But good.
And so, Pastor, this is Rich down in Daphne, Alabama, coastal Alabama. Can I? This is honestly, I really appreciate this block. Can I pile in on this one and some of the things we think about down here?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure. And so, as we kind of frame out disaster response down here, very quickly we get into rural areas, much like probably most areas of the Synod, and obviously hurricanes are always a consideration here. We see those coming from a long way off. The other one that hits every now and then throughout Alabama and in parts of our congregational area are tornadoes. Really, kind of short suspense. They happen, and then all of a sudden things go crazy. So I appreciate the point. So I really want to make 2 points. We have systems in place to kind of talk to local media and kind of get the information and share the information kind of vertically. But then we also have systems in place like laterally where we communicate with the congregation. And I saw the note on Facebook in the chat. We actually have kind of a couple different methods because, honestly, some of our congregation are more digitally adept than others. So sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's Facebook, sometimes it's a text, sometimes it's a whatever. And to be sensitive or kind of be aware of that kind of pre-disaster, it really helps to kind of pull the congregation together very, very quickly to form a cohesive response. The other thing I would add too is, so that right there is kind of a position in our disaster framework, not only like communication to external agencies, but communication laterally just within the congregation. And then the other thing we think about a lot down here too is because we can get rural very quickly is mobility. We have some of our congregation is a little elderly. We have some shut-ins, and sometimes we have to go to the point of care. Not so much helping with disaster recovery, but just helping with disaster recovery within our own congregation. And so that's something that I think is worth thinking about. I hope I didn't waste your time. I hope I'm adding to the conversation.
Oh no, that's exactly what I was hoping to get. You meant, and I'll cover it a little bit later, but you mentioned the term you used, I think, was lateral communication within your congregation. That has been one of the most difficult things our church has come up with in developing our plan, is how to effectively reach, as you mentioned, people that may not be digitally adept, people that still use landlines that may come down in a tornado in Birmingham, which is our primary disaster risk, I think. How do you get those? And I've talked with other members of the disaster ministry over the years, and they do various types of phone trees, shepherd groups, care teams. One of them used a term, may have been Stacy, I don't remember, that they have a mother hen that has taken upon herself to check in with 10 or 12 of the most vulnerable elderly members that they have known for years. And she's, it's one person has taken that responsibility on. But how do we codify that and put it in our plan is something that each church will have to work with.
And I'd say, especially for that population, that's where, assessing ahead of time and knowing who they are, that you can network and ask them to have their neighbor who might have, a cell phone. So we had an elderly member that only had a landline, and when the snowpocalypse came in the Atlanta area, they lost their landline because of the ice. And so we were able, because we already had a relationship with the neighbor, to be able to call and say, are they okay? Do they have heat? Do they need anything? Which, was an easy way for us to communicate with somebody who had technology. And they were already a part of that support network. So, you need to sometimes look at, who can be the person in your congregation who can do that, but then what resources do those people have that can assist in that? And that neighbor really became significant as that person also then eventually had some health issues, to keep us informed, to say, they really need more help because they're not going to the grocery store and they're not doing this. So it kind of avoided a personal disaster because we already knew what was going on that our member wasn't necessarily going to share with us. So look beyond just who is in your congregation and determine who might also be a resource to help in the midst of a disaster like that. So that lateral communication is extremely helpful.
One of the other things that Sherry Baresh from Inspiritus, and as we were waiting and watching for Marco and Laura, she suggested that we have paper copies of phone numbers. Because if cell towers go down, most of us have everything programmed in our phones, and we may not have that information available to us. So even with our families, but maybe especially with our congregations, to have who would have guessed, a real paper copy.
Yes, thank you.
Things that may be pertinent, maybe just to our area, but that is, we've got Fort Benning. I mean, it's right here, and heaven forbid, when you go back to the Cold War status, there was a time when major military installations were going to be either in the first wave or maybe the second wave of missiles fired, and that brings a whole different kind of thing into our area here, where we're talking about widespread impact based on how powerful that particular missile might be. So something we might have to consider, but maybe not others.
Right. I think that's the benefit of this type of get together, is to get all of y'all and us thinking about what might be specific to my area that may not be common in a risk assessment for the Southeast. Pastor Jill mentioned the snow apocalypse, 5 years ago now, which caught so much of the Birmingham swath through Atlanta completely off guard. We ended up with 15 people walking into our church from the closed road and staying 3 days. Luckily, we were able to feed them from our internal food bank, and many of them had gone to the store to prepare and brought their own food in because they couldn't get anywhere. But that's something even in the Southeast to think about, is ice storms and snowstorms. So any other comments, and we'll move a little bit on past our risk assessment and go to the next.
One of the things that I've done in my other volunteer work with the American Cancer Society is just kind of, doing like a center bubble. This is your congregation, and then where are those things that are around you that could impact your specific community? So, you know, do you have a hospital that's nearby that it's, you know, it's the midst of whatever, right? You know, that your congregation might end up having people coming there to get, you know, they need some place to get information and the hospital uses you. Just kind of looking at what's around you to say, okay, these might be impacted. During the snow apocalypse, you know, we had schools around us that couldn't get children home. And so our congregation did, like John, end up, you know, taking extra food over to them to be able to help out until parents could get there to get them picked up. So just kind of, you know, as a taking your committee or your group of people and just thinking about what are those things. Is there a military base nearby? Is there a nursing home nearby? Is there, you know, all these different things that could be, you know, impacted based off the location of where your congregation is, so that you kind of have, you know, not only, you know, what could be impacted, but what also are resources that are nearby that could assist in that process. So is there a blood bank nearby? Or, you know, how far is your, you know, your fire stations? Do you have a relationship with your fire stations so that you can know what's going on? And just doing kind of a little asset mapping is what they call it in the nonprofit world of what's around you can help you to have a better sense, not only in the midst of a disaster, but just how do we do ministry, right, to our neighbors and to know who's around you. And sometimes we just don't even know that. So for example, my congregation at the time, you know, there was a group home that was across the street of adults living with disabilities, and, you know, recognizing again in the midst of a storm that you that these places sometimes have staff that are now cut off, and, you know, they're not going to have the resources that they would normally have. So how can you help in that process? But if you don't know your community, you don't know that there might be a really significant need in those places. So just another way of kind of looking at what's around you and laying it out, and an asset map kind of helps you to figure that out.
Yes, thank you. That's one of the things we'll get into in a little bit. And the last disaster that is so hard to talk about and yet is unfortunately a fact of life is, how do you plan for an active shooter scenario? And there are some of the sheriff's departments and police departments do have training for churches to look at that. We have adapted a program that's from U.S. Steel, which is a large, you know, steel mill in our area, but it's something that's an unfortunate fact of life. So that's one of the disasters that is, well, all disasters are local is the comment you often hear, but that's one that's hardest to plan for, and yet it seems to be something that's more common than we would have guessed. Pastor Morgan, I think we are running up on got a new slide and we're at 20 minutes after. Shall we take our 10-minute break and come back at 10:30?
We got a little bit off schedule, so maybe we can adjust by about 5 or 6 minutes. So why don't you go ahead and go through human assets and stop after ministry assets.
Very good, thank you. So one of the things Pastor Jill just mentioned is the term asset mapping. It's basically an inventory of the assets that the members of your church can bring in the event of a disaster. And so the first thing we talk about is, and everybody's going to have some type of list of their members and contact information. Keep it current. And how do you do that? You know, the best way is going to vary by your technology levels and your congregation, but that's the most important thing. And then an easy way to contact your staff. Again, this day and age, there's going to be email, there's going to be text messaging, there's going to be Facebook direct messaging. In the event of a disaster, the Facebook I'm Safe feature is very useful. And then get to know who in your congregation can do things. Doctors and nurses are obvious, but vets. One of the things they found out when they evacuated the coastline after Katrina, the main reason many people wouldn't leave is none of the shelters at the time accepted pets. People are not going to leave their animals behind. So as people now have changed, some of the shelters are allowing pets. You need vets to be able to kind of keep an eye on things. Other skills, you know, who are your handy guys? What about your habitat team? Are they available to be on an early response or a recovery phase of your disaster so that you can mobilize them quickly to head on out? And then who uses your church? If you did a list of the various groups, it probably would surprise you that Weight Watchers, AA, Al-Anon, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts. We have a model train group that meets in our, well, before COVID, met in our church. Do you have a standing list to get a hold of these people in the event the building may not be safe to use? So again, it sounds like a lot of list making, but that's part of the communication. And then who in your community is kind of related that you do things with? Do you send groups out to your nursing homes? Are you able to notify them that your nurse that you send is not able to go due to a disaster in the area? And then part of your plan, which is kind of the easier part or the more obvious, but what are your physical assets? Yeah, Jill has mentioned four-wheel drive and snowplows. Your physical property, your mentioned earlier, do you have some valuables? You know, in the olden days, people, you know, locked up the silver communion elements. I don't know if that's still a big a thing. Most likely it's going to be large screen TVs in your sanctuary or your fellowship hall, your computer systems, things that can be damaged, anything that can be damaged, your banners or tapestry. What kind of assets do you have, and can you get those covered by insurance? Can you get things off the floor in an event there may be flooding? Your kitchen equipment, and things that you can actually remove from the building if there is a widespread, either a large track tornado or if you're in a hurricane area. Who's going to have that? Who has access to that? Who has access to the safe that you keep things? If you don't deposit your church money directly, you can't usually on a Sunday. So does it stay in a safe? Who can get that out and rescue that? These kind of physical assets need to be inventoried and a plan made to protect them as much as possible. If you're in a hurricane area, who's in charge of boarding the windows if that's what your church plan calls for? And how do you get a hold of those people? And have you practiced that? Can you do that with a day's notice in a fast-moving storm? So these are some of the things that you need to consider as you set your plan up. Talked about this a little bit with codes or passwords for the safe. If you're anything else, perhaps if you have locked areas for the sacristy, things like that, who might have a key to the office, how you can track those things needs to be in your plan so that they can get to quickly and easily. Do you have a plan with your escape routes so that these should be posted at every room's doors, but you have a blueprint that makes that easy to come up with? So again, some of these other things are on the screen in front of you. I won't read them, but some of the many assets that you need to think about protecting. And lastly, that we'll cover in this section is your financial assets. Can you get to these things if your church computer is out of order? Who has a comprehensive picture of all the financial instruments that your church uses? Do you have contact information for your insurance agent, perhaps your Thrivent guy, your mission investment fund, any of the various things that churches do to handle money and investments? Where are they? How do you hide them, or not hide them? How do you back them up, and how do you access them remotely? And who can do that? And then, of course, some of the other things, it's a disaster if there's internal malfeasance. So do you do an audit in your church? And who does that? Is that separate from the financial sector? Do you have a separate audit team to do these kind of things? And then how would you handle donations for disaster related donations of funds or supplies? One of the things the Synod has come up with is a program called Congregational Connectedness, I believe, that allows a congregation to distribute some funds in the event that a social ministry organization is not able to do that on a small scale. Who's going to manage that, and how is that going to be tracked? So these are things that you don't think of initially, but the faster that you can recover them, the quicker you can set back up and be on your road to recovery. So at that point, we've kind of drifted into our break time. If we'll take a break and come back in 10, I think we're good to go.
Thank you, John. So we're officially on break. I think you're muted, my friend. There you go.
Here we go. All righty, welcome back, everyone. Thank you. We continue to talk about assets. What is your assets do your church provide? I think if you think about it, you'd be amazed at the different activities, groups, things that use your church building. Whether there's some examples here, AA meetings, Christian education. Ones to add to this would be scouting groups, for example, other community groups that, excuse me, meet there. Do you have your VOAD meetings? Do they meet in your church? Or we have had church conference meetings there. So all these things access your church, and you're kind of a ministry to them. One of the things mentioned here is certifications your congregation may have. Whether you're a Red Cross shelter, which some requirements are needed, but do you offer a preschool? Will you be able to do that if you can't meet the requirements, the licensing requirements after a disaster? So one of the questions we would have then is, what assets does your church have? What gifts did you bring to the community? What surprises you? And is your church using the assets that your building has and that these groups bring? How could they use those when you respond to a disaster? And how do you keep things going? One of the huge challenges with COVID is there are groups like AA, which is anonymous, so that how do you allow them to continue if you can't hit the requirements of contract tracing? So that's a question that I don't have an answer for, that our particular COVID task force in our church is wrestling with. And it's kind of under the purview of if it's life and limb, is that overtake? Is it more critical that to let AA meet, for example, or a group that requires anonymous, honest sharing from people for their health over the concerns of a potential spread of this virus? So these are questions that don't have great answers, but at least it's something to consider and to talk about and decide where on the risk spectrum your church is willing to go. One of the things we've talked about a little bit earlier is vulnerabilities. And some of those are both where your church is located, as example here with the railroad and low-lying areas. And the other thing is, how old is your church and what is its construction? If you're one of the wooden built mission churches from the 60s, you've got a lot of wood and flammable things to consider. Or if it's a more modern steel and glass structure, you know, you have glass to worry about. So each type of church building is going to have its own particular set of concerns about protection and vulnerabilities. And how do you prevent those? Term used earlier in the discussion of the life cycle of preparedness is mitigation. So how do you plan ahead for the next time? Small example would be pre-cut plywood for boarding windows. Do you have a place to store that? Do you have a way to get things up off the ground and a way to store them if you do get 3 inches of water on your basement from routine gutter backup, which is common in a lot of our older buildings. And then part of this whole process is insurance. Who does insurance for your church? Are you adequately covered for all the groups that use your church? Who is responsible for what? Again, with COVID, excuse me, the group that's using the church, are they responsible for any type of contact tracing or any type of follow-up in the event of an outbreak, or are you? These things need to be addressed. Do you have insurance for fiscal mismanagement? You're going to have property insurance, damage insurance, and then do you have plans to background check people for your teachers in Sunday schools to prevent or at least to help mitigate or prepare for some things that may come down in the future? And what do you think you need to prepare for? What are the things that your individual church needs to address? This stuff can be pretty overwhelming. Unfortunately, there's just, things are changing and it's something we have to just discuss and work our way through. The goal here is to be able to continue our presentation of ministry despite the various vulnerabilities and things that are going on in the community. Questions? We're about to kind of change things up a little bit and pass it back to Morgan. Is there any questions or any comments before we go on? Actually, let me cover this last slide here, I believe. We're not alone. One of the things that you'll find as you get into the disaster ministry is there are a lot of people out there. Government, EMA from a local level on up, FEMA. One of the changes that I've seen in disaster response in 20 years is governments are getting a little bit better at it, all the way down at the local level. And there are organizations like Crisis Cleanup and 211 Connect that kind of help bring all these various other outside agencies together under a big tent so that disaster response is a little bit better coordinated. And this is often worked through VOAD, which is the organization of organizations, if you will, that are volunteer groups that are active in disaster response. Some of them are community-based, not necessarily United Way, things of that. Many others are faith-based. All the major denominations have dedicated groups. I don't know if you can see my shirt, Lutheran Disaster Response. You think of that and you think of, well, that's got to be, hundreds of volunteers warehoused in Chicago ready to go. But LDR is really a very small group of very hardworking paid staff under church auspices, and then it's the rest of us. We are, as Morgan mentioned early on, we are Lutheran Disaster Response. Whether you're out there mucking out a building or calling on the shut-ins in your community following an event, we are Lutheran Disaster Response. And there are, many others. There are chainsaw groups. There are Salvation Army, Red Cross, the list that we've talked about earlier. But the more you can be connected, the more people that you meet in these groups, the easier it is to get going following a disaster. If you have some phone numbers and some relationships that you've developed, it sure beats starting from scratch, wondering who the players are, how you can get your group involved, how you can offer your church up as an asset to the people in need. Questions, comments? Okay.
Tell me again what VOAD stands for.
Voluntary organizations active in disaster.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. I just want to continue in the same vein with when you're putting together your plan. That my internet's unstable, so if I come and start to leave, I'll come back. In disaster, things change, and sometimes you may have to make decisions for the mission and ministry of the church that relate to responding to the disaster. So it's important to have an idea of who needs to make what decisions and when, and what kind of approvals you may need in order to make those decisions. For instance, as John mentioned earlier about if you had a preschool before and you need to have a recertification, or you are looking at expanding or providing one because the preschools in your community have been destroyed, you then have to know how to proceed in that. So who would be the person within the congregation, the persons, how would they go about doing that kind of investigative work and obtaining the appropriate certifications, and who would need to approve those type of activities? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. One of the things that John mentioned earlier was a problem we had in past disasters was shelters would not take pets. So congregations would stand up a pet shelter. For instance, Christus Victor had a pet shelter in their in their playground. They used that space to house pets, and also parts of the building to house pets, so people would feel confident enough to leave an unsafe dwelling. So, those are, do you just do that? How do you do that with the congregational body making a decision together to make sure that that's something they want to do? It can get messy and cumbersome, but if you have these kind of conversations ahead of time when you're making your plan, so that people, after the disaster has passed, they can say, well, you did this, and we would not have done that. Well, if you had followed an orderly way of getting approval for certain actions, then you can say, we did it the way we planned. And that helps people feel like due process was taken, and they had a part in that by approving the plan. So things can get kind of strange. You also may be, as a congregation in the middle of a disaster, you may be asked to help by others in your community, other organizations. For instance, the Red Cross just sent me a letter saying, we really would like to use your building as a shelter. Will you sign this contract? I did not reach out to them. They reached out to me because of our location and very close to the state. You may be asked if after a disaster your building is more intact and you have resources in your physical plant that are needed for the healing of your community. So the mayor may call you. Who knows? The EMS may say, look, we need a place for emergency ops. Can we use your Sunday school rooms? One congregation housed an entire primary clinic because the primary care clinics that they had were destroyed. May be invited to serve by an entity from the outside in your community. Volunteers, or host a community worship service. But there are a lot of ways that you can support. For instance, in the ice and cold weather, freezing, you may serve as a warming station. Or if power is out, strip for with phone chargers for people to come and charge their cell phones. A place that provides respite. So there are a lot of ways that churches can serve. Just lots. It's important, we can't stress the creation of your communication plan. This is the most important piece, I think, of your disaster. You've got to be connected with the people within your congregation. And you've got to be connected with the leader aspects of the disaster. So you have to have multiple ways of contacting, like Pastor Jill's having a neighbor who, has a cell phone if the person only has a landline. If there is a connecting point out home or another person who they're going to connect with. Do the hard work first, because that will serve you well. That can be your backup for any kind of emergency in your congregation where you need to get in touch with everybody in the phone trees. We do phone tree, we do email, we do text messages, we do Facebook, our Facebook group, and then we also have shepherds that have underneath them 7 to 8 people, members, or families that they personally check. So if a person gets the same message 4 times, that's great. We just want to make sure they get it one time. We try to do the shepherds close to where these people live, if it's all possible. So create that communication plan, and you have to keep updating it all the time because people change phone numbers, They change email addresses, you know, just keep updating it. Make plans to check on the frail elderly and the congregation. Know their plans for an evacuation. There was an elderly gentleman in a car coming through. He just got in his car. He was not in very good health. He was going to go and evacuate somewhere in Texas. Well, he spent about 16 hours on the interstate. We're going to evacuate to Texas. And we couldn't find him for like 3 days. We were just, you know, we had gone to his home. We were just about to break into his home. His son had not heard from him. We did not have an idea that this is what he was going to do. So part of our concern about that was just a month before, we had a single adult who died in his home, and we did not know. And no one knew for several days. So we know that people who are not connected with, or don't have a real tight social circle around them, we have to be attentive to them and make sure that we can check in on them. So this kind of preparedness work is really important. So, and have a follow-up plan on how you're going to check on them, folks, afterwards. John, back to you.
All righty, plans for emergency operations. This is part of the preparedness, the physical, what do we do? Couple of things that are important. If you have to evacuate, where are you going to go? Just like your home plan with the kids, are you going to have a plan for the back part of the property and to count heads, for example? If you need to shelter in place, what is your tornado plan? Do you have an inside wall that's large enough to pack most members of the congregation in? Do you have a way to keep people safe if they can't go out? Then, as we mentioned, unfortunately, a lockdown procedure. If you get something, a call from the sheriff's department that they're, you know, whatever, a bank robbery in the area, to lock your front doors. Do you have a way to do that quickly? And do you have a way for monitoring the weather? Weather radios obviously are an obvious thing, but do you have somebody in the narthex in the event of expected pretty bad weather? They need to be not listening to the service and checking their phone, but you need to have them paying attention to what's going on in a way to go ahead and shelter in place if that's the case. So all these need to be thought ahead, as are the exit plans that we talked about earlier that are required to be posted at your doors. So we talked about nearby storm shelter. In most of our urban areas, it's going to be sheltering in place. One of the follow-ups from the Tuscaloosa tornadoes of 10 years ago was that some of our rural areas have put up dedicated tornado storm shelters. If that's the case in your area, do you know where it is? Who opens it? How you get to it? Is that something that you can get to from your church quickly? Go ahead and have a drill. I know everybody hates to take Sunday time, but periodically, just like when we were in school many years ago, go ahead and have a practice drill if you can. And you have a way to get people downstairs if the power's out, for example, and your elevator's not working. And then we talked about a weather radio or a battery operated radio or a monitor with a cell phone that needs to be paying attention just to that.
You know, when you're making your plan, you need to think about how you're going to continue the ministry of the congregation. It's often said that disaster is seductive, meaning that when you're in the middle of a disaster, it's easy only on the disaster. It just is natural. You can't help it. So all of your energy will go toward the disaster, but you also have to keep in mind the care of the congregation and the needs of the members. So just recognizing that it is a challenge to maintain your normal ministry sometimes in the middle of a disaster, but at the same time, you need to care for the people and you need to find ways to continue the ministries within reason, but also to be open to new opportunities for service. I mentioned some of those before. The community will need the congregation's care and gifts. So to look at these new opportunities with an eye of opportunities for. Many times congregations will begin a disaster ministry, will find it very life-giving and enjoy it and be part of, enjoy being part of this community response. When I was at Lebanon at Faith Lutheran Church, we housed disaster ministry volunteers. And we set up a housing unit behind the congregation. And our congregation at that time was extremely, and we experienced such, it was so inspiriting before even Inspiritus had their name. It was inspiriting for the congregation to be around other volunteers that were so passionate and active in their service. So it can be life-giving to a congregation, but disasters and disaster response ends. It has its life cycle, and there are times when those ministries have to shut down, and that can be an awkward and somewhat sad time, especially if it has been one that the congregation truly embraced. So making plans in the beginning, knowing that this is a temporary ministry and that there will come a time when you will have to scale back and end. Keeping that in the front of your mind is really important.
Okay, it's kind of winding down a bit as we talk about our plan. It doesn't do any good if you have a plan if it just languishes and it never gets approved and people don't know you have it. So once the plan is prepared, typically you will go through your council, get it approved at that level, and then you want to present it to the congregation. You want to show them why you've done it. You want to show them the steps that are involved. And you want to have some, if you've built a big enough team to develop your plan, then you're going to have a better chance of getting some buy-in by the church and to actually implement it and use it. Something, and then as you approve it, it needs to be implemented and accessed different ways. Okay. So practice, again, we talked about with evacuation drills. But it's something that if you have somebody, 2 or 3 people that have been shown the utility cutoffs, for example, 2 or 3 people that know how to have the list to get a hold of all the groups that are using your building if they can't, for example, so they can get updates out quickly and efficiently. And people turn over in a church. People move on, so that they need to be introduced to this plan and show them how it works. And then we're not always going to be the ones in charge. As much as my wife says that's not the case, hopefully you'll develop new leadership and bring this in and have them continue what we're doing. But practice the plan, review it, and get buy-in by your congregation. So kind of to sum the plan up, it's a guide for several things. One is to bringing your church together. It's to protect the property that you have, care for members, reaching out to members, and reaching out to your community. Again, your church serves more than just the members that you have. It serves many around your community that you may not often see. It's to recover and repair damage, disaster-related damages. How do we communicate and to plan for community response? How can you be an asset to your community if you're up and running? Morgan talked a little bit about hosting volunteer groups. We have had similar experience with that. It is an incredibly rewarding way to be involved if your members aren't always young enough or active enough anymore to go out and do some of the hard physical work, but they obviously want to be involved. If you can host a group, feed them meals, that brings everybody together to get us through what's going on. But to sum it up again, it's planning. And it's what you do in the beginning of a disaster cycle, the mitigation and preparedness. It's a lot easier to have this stuff done now than it is when you're under the gun with a roof that's got a blue tarp on it and water up to the level of your pews. Okay.
John, we had a question. Do we have a sample plan for maybe a congregation that could serve as a model? I know that Morgan sent the guide from LDR to kind of start, but is there kind of a sample one that we can share?
I have one that Mary Brusso did for her church that I will get permission to share that and make it available. Mary's is very well done. It brings in a little more. They had a more biblical background for some of the things that they did and why. The one that Shepherd of the Hills is working on is a little more nuts and bolts, so that might be 2 good examples to contrast. But I'll make sure that I can share that and make it available.
Thank you. I believe creativity is forgetting where you saw it first. So if we can, sometimes it's just having someplace to start. Would you
Yes.
also recommend that that the very first step might be for these disaster coordinators to get permission from their council to start making a plan, so that people are aware that they're going to be doing this?
Permission's not the word I would have used, but I think advise the council that this is something that needs to be done.
Okay.
That might save a whole month of voting and discussion.
Yeah, I just would hate for someone to start this whole process and then their council say, well, we don't want this. And then,
Well, that's true.
so, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important point to bring up, Pastor Jill, because I think if you coordinators, if you would meet with your council and express the having this plan and then offer to shepherd them through the process, that would be a good first step. because it has to be part of the organization, or else the communication won't be in place, or the decision making won't be in place, or the fiscal management won't be in place. So it has to have that legitimate connectedness. But my experience has been that the only reason some congregations don't have one is they haven't had someone like yourselves willing to volunteer your time and passion to do the research and to learn about disaster and help shepherd it through the process. So I can't imagine a council saying, no, I don't want you to do that. If you come and say, let me help you, they're going to go, thank you, thank you, thank you. And you are the first step for many congregations to make disaster ministry part of the congregation's mission. Disaster is touching us more and more and more, and it's not unlikely to stop. It's not likely to stop. We're going to be seeing this. So the more you can help your congregation be prepared and help them develop their own strength in ministry, the better they're going to be able to cope when disaster hits them. This is really helping you and your family and your church. Be strong, because we're going to have to be strong in these crazy changing days. And if you have a strong disaster ministry team, you have just expanded the leadership within your congregation, and it really does help. Really does help. Again, as John had mentioned, ministry is a call to care for the neighbor, and it may be the neighbor in your pew sitting next to you, or the neighbor who's next door, or in your community, or even farther away. It's a time when we build relationships of service with the disaster preparedness and response people in our own communities. Host a lunch and invite folks from the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church and the synagogue that are involved in doing the very same work you're doing. What we're doing here is being done in nations. Everybody has a disaster arm in faith communities, because it's the faith communities who get out and respond initially. That's, you just see that. So we have a lot of partners out there. So build those relationships in your community with those folks. You might see them at bingo. They might be right there at the Y and water aerobics. But they're doing this work too. Seek them out. And then make plans, for your congregation. Shelter, food readiness. As we have seen with COVID, food readiness is an issue. And unfortunately, as economic insecurity moves forward, shelter is going to be an issue. So you plan for these things. You think about it. Not necessarily to be morbid, not to be morbid, but to be ready so that you can draw from some of your strengths. And then think about how you might participate in long-term rebuilding homes, being a support to people, emotional, spiritual support, and partnering with the people within your community with a special eye for those who have limited resources or no resources. So build leaders, as John said, and involved, because a lot of us in disaster response have white hair. And, we really do need more younger leaders to take the mantle. So come on, let's spread the word. There are a lot of ways that congregations have been involved. And I have just a few old pictures to lift up. Tyson House from Knoxville, they helped out after the fires in Gatlinburg. They were working in the distribution center there. Reformation youth group that took off down there to help. Their Shepherd of the Lake. Is your picture on there? I'm looking. Anyway, responding to the tornadoes in Athens. Can you have to tell them they were on there? And then again, the picture from Ocean Springs. There's so many pictures. I just threw up a few of these. But that's not the only way. You don't have to necessarily have a hammer or muck out or work in a distribution center. You can also do degrees of emotional spiritual care where you can provide camps for kids or have a listening ministry in your narthex where people can come in and tell their story over and over and over again. That is healing work for them. And often that is what is most needed, is just someone to listen. So there are many ways that you can provide emotional spiritual care. But I would like to ask if Pastor Stacy would unmute and talk about providing emotional spiritual care after the tornado in Louisville.
Well, thank you, Pastor Morgan. This has been one of the greatest gifts of my life, and we are 7 years past the tornado that hit here. And these kids that are in this picture still come up to me and talk to me about what it was like for them at these God's Can Do Kids. I still have parents reach out to me and say, these storms still impact my kids. Can you help me figure out what to do? And so all we did was create safe space for kids. There's a great curriculum called God's Can Do Kids. There's also a Camp Noah that's a little bit more involved and a little bit more expensive. But the God's Can Do Kids one is perfect. It's like a vacation Bible school, so you can do it. And all you really have to do is provide safe space for these kids. The first day we did it, we realized these kids just needed to play. We were at a church that had a playground, and the kids just hadn't even played. So we let them play. We just did the fun camp games just to get to know people and let them know that they were safe and that they were loved. And then we sort of moved on into the curriculum after that. And so it's easy peasy to do it. And you're just trying to give these kids a framework to process what happened to them. And to sometimes it's as simple as changing the narrative that God caused this tornado, that there's any kind of punishment in a tornado, to just say, no, God is right here with you in this. And that we don't have to be scared anymore. We can be prepared because God is with us. So please, I encourage everybody to figure out how to do this as you do disaster ministries, and we're happy to help you out. I have a bunch of supplies I'd be happy to bring to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Pastor Stacy. Pastor Stacy was the emotional spiritual care coordinator chair for the response after the tornadoes for the entire community. So this was one aspect of things that she did. And I'm going to kind of blow your cover here a little bit. She also did support groups and in the schools, and she also did counselings. She led and coordinated memorial services and ways that the community could come together and grieve and remember. So emotional spiritual care is a huge piece of disaster response. And we are, as the church, and as followers of Jesus, messengers of hope, and messengers of hope in the midst of suffering and a crisis. And you are uniquely positioned to be that in your community. So thank you. Thank you. There are some other resources that are listed on your handouts and your flyers, and you can get them. I've shared with you the Congregational Disaster Preparedness Guide, which these slides and the center has come directly from there, so that we are teaching the book. I used to get in trouble when I didn't teach the book at the University of South Alabama. They wanted me to teach the book, but I'm teaching the book here because I think it's a good book, and I want you to be able to read it and go back to it and know you've seen it, and maybe it will sit a little easier for you. There are other resources from Lutheran Disaster Response, so just go to that site, and disaster response guides and things that will be helpful. This is just the beginning. Check out National VOAD, which is a great resource because it combines all the voluntary organizations active in disaster and their resources. You can also go to FEMA.gov, look under their disaster response. They have a whole readiness section. You can go www.ready.gov and pull down material members within your congregation on how to do family readiness. And again, God's Can Do Kids, we can connect you with those resources, complete with the curriculum and the How to Do It books through your Synod disaster response. So we are coming up on a break, 10-minute break, and then we will come back for our last section where we will focus primarily on disaster response, pandemic, and COVID-19. Any questions before we do that? All right, then let's take 10 minutes. Disaster Ministry Committee folks, and of course, Pastor Jill's going to on COVID-19, and so we have more to talk about still, but let me go ahead and share this screen here real fast. Whoops, not that. There we go. Nope, there you are. I was doing a disaster preparedness workshop several years ago, and part of the preparation, we had handouts on, preparing for a tornado, preparing for a hurricane, preparing for this and that, and then we also had preparing for a pandemic. We have had preparedness documents for a pandemic for some time, for many years, and with the recognition that our biological, the biological impact could be significant. And if a community is not prepared, they might not be able to protect themselves or their families. We bring out these pandemic procedures during flu season to remind people to wash their hands and to stay away, not to go around people if you're sick. And we have seen all of those procedures needed and in an exaggerated, not exaggerated, in a pronounced way with COVID-19. We know that there is potential of new and even more threatening viruses down the road, and we have to know how to prepare our communities for this. And it's a disaster. It disrupts normal life. It interrupts commerce. It interrupts our worship experience. It interrupts school. It interrupts everything. So to be prepared, and you think about the potential spread of a virus or some type of biologic, you have to think about how you can shelter in place and how you can do things that you would normally off-site. So part of that is preparing for off-site or virtual worship, preparing for communication or pastoral care, preparing for the management aspects of the congregation, and educating on preparedness for pandemic and hygiene practices to prevent spread or contagion. This is where public health and disaster response come together. This is not new information. This is very old. It's just we've had to take it out and dust it off more. The impact phase. We have experienced the impact phase. People with COVID-19, people that, like with a hurricane, we anticipate a landfall. With COVID-19, we have one case and another 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 case, and we have overlapping impacts. So that chart that I showed you about the emotional cycle of a disaster, you can anticipate that there are people all over that emotional cycle at all times. That there are people in shock and there are people in the depths of depression. There are people who are recovering that are feeling like they're going to make it. And then there are all of us who live under the anticipation and the threat and the warning. So the impact of that is something that is particularly challenging for us in the disaster community, because we are addressing all emotional responses at once. Mitigation, again, lessening impact, lessening and preventing possible loss. Hand washing, social distancing, all the isolating, all the tracing, all the quarantine procedures, all the sheltering, all the cleaning, all of that is mitigation of a disaster. And again, we're responding, and we're doing the research with treatment, vaccine development, ramping up health services, providing care. Another piece is hunger. We're meeting needs that are this disaster has generated because of loss of jobs, because of loss of resources. People are hungry, so now we're feeding. So when you think about COVID-19, know that it impacts not just the individual who is ill, it impacts their family. We have seen it impacts our own communities, and it impacts our country and our world. So this is truly probably the biggest example of how why you need larger coordinated responses in order to address this disaster. Now I want to turn this over to Pastor Jill, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Pastor Morgan and John, for all the information. And I know a lot of you got involved in this disaster conversation because of COVID-19. And so I'm sure what I'm going to share with you hopefully is not new. This is, we've been at this for a little while. So, a lot of your congregations have already formed COVID-19 task force, and we're really appreciative for that. But I just I'm going to share my screen real quick here. And so you all can see, hopefully, move that over to there. This is our Synod website, www.elca-ses.org. Maybe this is better this way. Sorry, I'm trying to find the best place for you all on my screen so that you all can see. At the very top of the website is the COVID response bar. That's the easiest way to find the most up-to-date information as we have it. I do want you to know, though, as the disaster coordinator, that when there are storms coming, we often will put that information right on the front page. So for example, you'll see here a video that Pastor Katie Pash did with Bishop Strickland and Deacon Michelle Angelet as we were preparing for the two storms that came and eventually were hurricanes. So when we know of a disaster that's pending, like a hurricane that we can plan for, we'll try to put that information right on our front page of how congregations can respond. This is a great way for you to communicate with your congregation. Just take what we've already prepared and share it, because there are a lot of times we'll have a lot of good information about how our Synod is responding. And obviously a large way in which we do disaster response in the Synod is with the financial gifts from individuals and congregations. So when your congregation gives or an individual gives and it's an undesignated gift, what that allows us to do is to respond immediately to a storm. So for example, when the tornado took place in Nashville, within 24 hours, we were able to give Pastor Morgan money to be able to buy a generator to go over to where Inspiritus is now being housed. It's the old St. Paul's Lutheran Church facility, and save their food pantry because they had no power. We were able to power their refrigerator and freezer and keep the food from spoiling, as well as providing, as Pastor Morgan mentioned, cell phone charging and other resources for the community. That was able to happen literally within hours of the tornado because we had undesignated funds that were in our disaster response designated accounts to be able to respond. We also have designated accounts that are specific. So the Mississippi storms that we talked about earlier, people gave specifically to those, and that's what was able to fund programs like the emotional spiritual care camps that are there. So a large portion of what we do is out of those individual gifts that come to the Synod. And then because we have incredible people on our Synod team, like Pastor Morgan Gordy, who are able to write grants to the National Lutheran Disaster Relief, we're then able to get matching funds. So she mentioned food insecurity during COVID. We were able to give $50,000 worth of grants to congregations for food ministries, especially specifically due to the COVID-19 crisis. And that happened because, again, we had undesignated funds that we could leverage while writing a grant. And so we partially funded those. And then we had matching funds, actually 2 to 1 of our gifts. LDR was able to match our grants so that we could fund individual congregations in their food ministries. That's not your responsibility as a disaster coordinator. I'm just letting you know kind of what happens when someone gives money to disaster relief in the Synod, or if they give disaster relief to Lutheran disaster relief at the ELCA level, how those funds are used. We now have a partnership with Inspiritus to do disaster relief. And so when you, if someone gives to them, it also goes to our partnership response in the middle of a disaster. And so we're really grateful for that partnership and the gifts that they bring to the table, because they do have those people that are already got the certifications that they need to go into a disaster immediately and can be on the ground. You may or may not know, but Lutheran Disaster Relief is known for being there for the long haul. And so they don't come in and gone. There are other organizations that do that, like Red Cross and Salvation Army. Not to say that they don't have long-term ministries as well that continue beyond, but and it's not to say that we're not always on the ground right at the very beginning, because we are. As you probably saw after the tornadoes in Nashville, we were up and running with over 4,000 volunteers immediately when that storm happened. But we're committed to being there for the long haul. So that does mean spiritual and emotional support. It does mean continued groups coming in sometimes years after a disaster happens. My first experience in disaster response happened with flooding in Fargo, North Dakota. And we went in 3 years after the floods and we're continuing to do rebuilds and helping them to recover from a flood there. And you know, disaster response does not mean that you have to know how to use a chainsaw or how to do drywall. My role for that whole trip was to make sandwiches to take to others who were doing that work. Because I can make a sandwich and I can cook dinner, but you don't want me to be mudding drywall, because it won't look good and someone will have to spend more time sanding afterwards. So, you know, use your gifts for the way in which you are able to use your gifts. But specifically in terms of COVID response, as I said, if you click on the COVID response bar, it'll put up the most recent stuff that we have. We do have our COVID guidelines, and hopefully you've gone through those. They have lots of links to various recommendations by the CDC, by the World Health Organization, as well as other resources that are available in terms of guidelines for things that are continually updated. Someone asked recently on one of our webinar, our council leader Zooms, about whether anything has changed within those guidelines. Because it says in there that when we get to phase 2 and phase 3, we will update those guidelines. Unfortunately, because of the nature of this pandemic and where we are, we really, and I have lots of epidemiologists that keep telling me this, we haven't really moved out of phase 1 in our communities. And so that we haven't necessarily updated those. I will tell you that we do have some additional things that we've added to the website that is available for you. And we are working on, and I'm hoping to have up here in the next week or so, specifically a legal guidance about contact tracing. We've gotten some questions from congregations about how do you do that and follow the law, making sure that you're keeping confidentiality and providing pastoral care for someone who's tested positive for COVID. Specifically, as we know, congregations have begun to have some in-person ministries that have taken place. So that document is being worked on by our Synod attorney in partnership with some input from the CDC. As you're working with your COVID task force in your congregation, please know that the Synod's task force is made up of people who are just that, experts in their fields. So we have lawyers, we have an epidemiologist, we have other people that work in the healthcare, and we have people that work at the CDC that are guiding us in this, as well as a representative from our disaster relief task force. So any of these recommendations that come from that, they've really been vetted not only through our committee, but through other people who work within this COVID pandemic. One of the things I think that congregations should be aware of, if you come onto the website, click on this COVID-19 assessment tool. This was an app that was put together by Georgia Tech, and hopefully it will put up, but you can put in, you'll see the United States here, and our 4 states right here are pretty dark. That's because we continue to see increases in COVID across our areas. And our epidemiologists and our folks from the CDC really would like to, really need your help to spread the word that if your local community is not necessarily showing an increase, that you need to look beyond your local community. For example, I live in Metro Atlanta. My people that live around me don't live within a mile of where I live. They go to work downtown or to the airport, or they can be an hour commute from where I live. And so there, if you think about that, if you were to zoom into like my area, I'd need to look at really, almost 2 hours from my house of all those communities that are being impacted because our people are crossing those boundaries. So we don't kind of stay in our areas, but you can put in specifically your county and see. Let's see if I can get to where I live. Oh, it's so close, almost there. And you can kind of see what your risk level is. So for example, Cobb County has, the current risk area is 94%. It's pretty high, right? And when you click on that community, or let's go over to, did I go too far? There we go. If you go into those specific counties, you can also, it will allow you to put in the number of people that might be gathered. So for example, my husband's also a pastor and he's doing a wedding this afternoon. You can put in, if you're having 20 people at the wedding, what the risk assessment is for that particular community, and get some idea as to what kind of mitigation you need to be doing in that. So this is a great tool, especially if you have people in your community that are really badgering to say, we need to be back in worship. We need to be, worshiping together, to help them to see what's going on. I mean, if you look over here in the Birmingham area, I mean, you're looking at like a Tuscaloosa County, a current risk level of 99%. And so that's really, areas in Mississippi. Mississippi, unfortunately, is kind of one of the fastest. Yeah, woo, Pastor Stacy's like, this is great. One of the fastest areas of transmission at this point, and it's a trickle down effect, right? So you have a higher risk area, which also then means your local community hospitals are beginning to get at capacity. We do have a bunch of videos that are on here. One of them is our epidemiologist, Dr. Erica Mornstead, that talks about how to read those indicators. So you might want to watch that video to see what does it mean when they're talking about community spread and those kind of things. So those videos are housed here. We also have some guidelines from worship. We are fortunate that one of our pastors has been a part of an ecumenical group that was sponsored out of Candler Seminary to kind of give some guidelines about how to do worship, what can we do in the midst of this. And we have some great digital resources. Most of you all have already figured out how to connect your congregation by Zoom or another platform, Facebook Live, to do worship. And as I mentioned earlier to someone, we do have the ability on the Synod's website, if you go back to the homepage, for sermons that you can watch from the Synod staff, or if people don't have the technology skills to be able to listen to a sermon on a telephone line, old-fashioned dial-in and press 1 to hear it in English, press 2 to hear it in Spanish. And so those things are available there. Also, when the bishop makes any kind of statements, those are posted here as well. So all of these are available for your COVID task force to be able to look at what your guidelines are. If you are a church mutual insurance person, they have a lot of great resources on their websites about signage, what you need to be putting on there. We still are big components, even though the CDC keeps kind of changing their recommendations for the five things you need to be doing in the midst of COVID. If you are washing your hands, for 20 seconds, wearing face coverings that are at least 2 layers thick. I have my lovely Luther Rose one that the bishop and Portico helped share. Making sure it's at least 2 layers. If you can blow a candle out with your mask, it's not doing what it needs to do. So just, that's a good thing to remind your folks. These are the types of things that you can communicate to your people through your Facebook or your newsletter at your church to help using hand sanitizer and cleaners. And we had a question about cleaners and how often. In terms of cleaners, it needs to be something that has a high alcohol content. And so COVID-19, it's the protein that needs to be broken down on the virus. So any kind of soap will do that as well, or a high alcohol content. And so, that's why just using regular hand soap, it doesn't have to be antibacterial to kill this. Just washing your hands for 20 seconds will break that protein down. Same for your sanctuaries or any of your facilities. It's very difficult right now to find like Clorox wipes or Lysol wipes. Originally, they said they would be back in stock by mid-July. I have not seen either of those brands out at all. So there are some recommendations you can Google how to make your own wipes to do that, but you don't really need that. What you need is, just a really good cleaner that has a high alcohol content to wipe down things. In terms of how often do you need to clean something? The recommendation still is that you are cleaning between any event. So if you are having physical worship, and hopefully you're doing that with a smaller group of people so that you can do the physical distancing of at least 6 feet, though the recommendations for that are saying that might even have to be farther, maybe 10 feet, that you're wiping anything that can be used during that worship down. That there's not shared items that would be used between members. So for example, if you have someone who is reading from a microphone, hopefully they're wearing a mask, that microphone isn't passed to somebody else to use to make announcements. So those kind of things, these are all spelled out in the guidelines. So you want to take note of those. Signage on your bathrooms, 1 person at a time in the bathroom is what the CDC is recommending, if possible, unless you're able to physically have more than that with the physical distancing guidelines. Outside is better than inside. FEMA will tell you that their recommendation is about 25% of your capacity for a space is what you can hold in your buildings, that you can have the physical distancing that is appropriate. So if your sanctuary can hold 100 people, you can do the math to figure out how many people you can have there. That's not your whole building, because obviously, if your whole building's capacity, is a lot more, if you're going to be meeting in a room. So if that's AA, maybe they've met in a Sunday school classroom, and they can't do that physical distancing. You might need to offer to them a different space to hold their group so that they can space out. But outside is better than inside. And luckily, we're moving into fall, so you can, still do some the gatherings with folks with social distancing. I do want to caution though, we are not just an organization. Most of our people think of our congregations as their family. I am as guilty as anyone else that I start off really good with my 6-foot distancing, and that's really easy to do when I go to the grocery store or I'm at the farmer's market. But you put me in a room with people I know, and I gradually get closer and closer and closer. So continuing to announce and remind people, or you may have to just be, have someone who's comfortable to say, to someone who isn't keeping physical distancing, you need to back up and give people permission to say, you might not need to come because you can't do what we're asking you to do in that process. It's not because we want to exclude anyone, but we want to keep everyone safe that is there. So being very clear about what those guidelines are before people come to worship is important. Making sure you're able to know how many people are coming. So how is your congregation going to register people for worship? Whether that's through a sign-up genie or Eventbrite or a Facebook event where they can register is helpful to allow people to know. Nobody wants to get up and come out to an event and then be told, I'm sorry, but we're full. And so helping your people to understand what that looks like. If your congregation is like my congregation, people want to come. And so helping them to understand why there's limitations in that and offering multiple opportunities if you are coming back to physically gathering for them to do that. So I've known congregations that have had outdoor communion services where it was limited to 20 people, but they had 4 opportunities in a weekend in order to do that. So maybe 2 on Saturday, 2 on Sunday, that allows the physical distancing that needs to happen, but then allows everyone the opportunity to come. I am more than happy to talk about specific congregational needs. If you'd like, you can email me and I can help you look at your own guidelines with that to determine what that looks like. Please be aware of whatever your local ordinances are, because we are not excluded from them. So if you have a mandate for masks in your community, which I would hope your congregation would have a mask mandate, but that no one come onto your property without a mask, but you need to follow that law. If you are in a shelter in place, please follow whatever your local ordinance tells you need to do. No one needs to be going out if you're in a shelter in place situation. I think in all of our states, and that's part of the reason why you haven't seen like a mandate from the Synod office for something specific, because we have 4 different states with 4 different governors, with 4 different legislators, with 4 different recommendations. But I do believe that all 4 of our states still have restrictions on people who are over the age of 65 and who have high risks to continue to shelter in place, except for going out for things of necessity. So those are all important things to remember as you are looking at your COVID response. As soon as I have the contact tracing document finalized from our lawyer and the other lawyers that are reviewing it, I will share that with you all so that you are that you have that for your local congregation. How your congregation can prepare if you haven't begun to physically gather, it is about, do you have the supplies to be able to come back? It's a lot easier now to find disposable masks than it was at the beginning of this pandemic. Your congregation may want to purchase some of those to have those on hand in case someone shows up for an event and doesn't have a mask. Or if you have, those wonderful Lutheran World Relief quilters, sewers out there to make some, to just have the cloth masks available that people can take. Available at the door when they come, that's great to have along there. If you are unable to get the cleaning supplies that you need, you probably shouldn't be gathering. I think a lot of our cleaning supplies are coming back and are easier to find. So finding something that can clean surfaces are easy to find. If you're struggling for that in your local area, what I would recommend is to look in your non-familiar places for your cleaning supplies. So like your local Kroger might be out, but your Ace Hardware might have stuff. or your Home Depot. I was just in Lowe's yesterday, and they had more cleaning supplies than I've seen in my local grocery store. So you might check those areas. Hand sanitizer is a lot easier to find. I would say one of the things, if you have people who are handy that are available, it's hard to find like the wall mounting stuff, but if you YouTube a PVC hand sanitizer stand, there are some very simple PVC contraptions to do a touchless hand sanitizer dispenser that you could make for probably $20 for your congregation to put out in front. A lot of congregations have mandated temperature checks. The CDC is kind of that, you know, someone can come who is asymptomatic, you can take their temperature, can be perfectly fine. They come in and then they end up having COVID symptoms. So, I mean, if that makes sure people feel better to take your temperature, then take their temperature. The touchless is obviously the best because you're not having to worry about cross-contamination of one that puts under your tongue or whatnot. But, you know, that is not, what you don't want to have is a false sense of security with that everyone who came in didn't have a temperature, so that, and they didn't have any symptoms, so they, you know, were COVID free. That's not necessarily true. I would recommend that you find out where you can be tested in your local area. Where are those testing sites that are there, so that if you do have someone who ends up with symptoms and tests positive, and you have to communicate with those who were at an event, that you can say to them in your own communication, if you don't know where to go to get tested, here are 5 places locally that are doing drive-through testing, so that you can equip them if they have come to your area and have been exposed. In terms of liability waivers, you know, your own local insurance policy might request that. So you need to check with your agent about that, and they may provide that. The reality is that this is the first pandemic we've had in 100 years. So no one really knows what's going to happen with liability. There's no way to know that even if they were exposed to somebody at a worship event, that's where that person got it from, because we're all out and about, and as schools reopen and people are more exposed, you just don't know, and we don't really know where the liability issue is going to come with this. And you know, as John's talked about earlier, just liability is one of the things you have to worry about in disaster relief. So you do want to check your insurance policy as to what that looks like, and how your insurance company wants to be informed, so that you're not violating your own policy in that process. So a lot of our churches, our church mutual, they have some great resources out there, not just for COVID-19, but just disaster preparedness. So check that out. And you're already paying those premiums, so you might as well use the resources that they're giving you as a part of that. I'm going to stop my sharing because I think I saw some questions that came in. Oh, okay. So John says he's getting permission to share the other churches, and he'll share his disaster plan in the next day or so. I will, if John sends those to me, I have everybody's email, so I will send them out to you all once you get those. And then Stacy recommended that people got creative at her congregation and got creative and requested like Kroger gift cards to be handed out at intake sites, and that's a really good way to fill the gaps when others cannot fill those gaps. You know, when Katrina happened 15 years ago, my congregation became a Red Cross shelter, which was great because they bring in all the resources that you need for that, and you just kind of supplement with a few things for that. Like we supplemented like collecting diapers because people came and they didn't have their stuff. But what came out of that was we had some members who just once a month gave us $25 gift cards, and we would keep those in the office and you know, determine what's available in your community. At that time, we had a Kroger that had a gas station attached to it, so it was great to be able to give people a Kroger gift card, and they could either get prescriptions, food, or gas cards. But I would recommend, if you do that in response to a disaster, that you have a way to keep track of who you've given gift cards to. Unfortunately, as you've seen, people take advantage of disasters, and they go from one place to the next sometimes. And so you want to just make sure that you're giving it to the people that need it and not to people who are taking advantage of the situation. So we always kept kind of a list of it, and we were in communication with other congregations to kind of say, you know, this is who we gave to, so that you didn't have people who were going from one place to the next. If they have that kind of need, that you can make that assessment, but unfortunately, people take advantage of that. Also, in your communication, unfortunately, and this has happened a lot during COVID, the Synod will never email a request for things that we aren't communicating, like on our website. So if you get an email from Bishop Strickland at gmail.com, that is not his email. Do not buy him. I forget what the last one was. It wasn't Etsy. It was crud. I can't remember it was like not, you know, it was a weird gift card that they wanted. We will not ask for those kind of things. We will ask you to make donations through our website. So confirm, if you get a text from your pastor saying, hey, Pastor Katie, could you buy me, or can you follow this link and give $25 to this? Your pastor's not sending you a text. That's been the newest scam, is that people are it looks like it's a text from your pastor asking for funds to be donated. So figure out how your congregation is going to request funds. And I really recommend a two different place verification. So, you know, your congregation is going to email people and say, and then it's also going to be posted on your website or posted on Facebook, that you are looking for these donations, or a direct link for giving, so that people don't get taken advantage of. So that people know that, yes, Pastor Stacy is looking for gift cards, and why, and that they can verify that it really is Pastor Stacy. I hate to say this, but unfortunately, disasters are usually a time when outside groups that are trying to take advantage are going to take advantage. So if you've already pre-communicated how you're going to respond, then your members will know that it is a verifiable ask, and not some bot from somewhere requesting funds, if that makes sense. I think that was all the questions that were in the chat box. Sorry. COVID is it's a continually moving situation, and so know that, just like in disasters, I will let you know that your disaster team for the Synod met, I think it was 4 times in the last 7 days, not to mention those that were meeting locally on VOAD and other calls that they were on. Our COVID task force meets probably twice a month, just to discuss what's come out that is new. But you know, we're constantly reviewing what's going on to make new recommendations and to communicate those as we're able to. Same with disaster relief. If we know that a disaster is pending, whether that's an ice storm, a hurricane, or that there's a threat of tornadoes, the disaster team probably is meeting behind the scenes, and will be communicating with those who are in affected areas as soon as possible. As Pastor Morgan said, this is a partnership between congregations, the Synod, and the national church together. And so we are constantly making sure that everyone's being communicated with. I will let you know that in terms of the Synod staff, as soon as we know a disaster is happening, we are reaching out to our deans, who are reaching out to your pastors, to make sure that we have communication and to know if they are evacuating and what's going on. So you can be in conversation as the disaster coordinator with your pastor to kind of say, okay, what's the next steps going forward for things. If your congregation has been directly impacted, for example, St. John's in Nashville, this building was destroyed in the midst of that tornado. The bishop will be working with the pastor to determine what other support that congregation is going to need, especially if that local pastor's own family was affected by a disaster. We'll be appointing someone to come and help the congregation with pastoral care needs in that process. So that's all a part of the plan that is there to support the congregation. And the other side of it is that, while we're known as the Disaster Synod, we're also supporting other synods in their disaster, and they're supporting us in our disaster. So we've been in contact with our brothers and sisters in the Texas-Louisiana Synod to provide evacuation sites through Novus Way and through camps in Texas for low cost response for that. So whenever we have that information, that'll go immediately up on our Synod's website so that you can communicate that with your members. We are very fortunate to have congregations like Ascension and Jackson who have served as evacuation sites for people along the Gulf Coast to come inland if a storm's approaching, as well as congregations in the Atlanta area for the Georgia coast to come. And one of the things that is, you look at your own disaster plan is, can the Synod staff help you find a congregation to partner with? So, if you are in Savannah, where would be a congregation in the Atlanta area that they could come to if you need someplace to go in that process, knowing that hotels and that kind of stuff fill up quickly to be able to do that. So I know that our folks in Augusta have done that. Athens has done that in the past, had people come up from the Georgia coast to stay in members' homes when we weren't in the middle of COVID. In COVID, we can work things out in terms of resourcing other places. And so our camps have been a great resource to be able to they were offering $25 a night to stay, and that basically just covers their cleaning. So those resources are available, and the Synod staff and the Synod office will be communicating those things as soon as we know that they are available to help people make plans. And when we have a hurricane, we have days to prepare, right? So we're trying to get those things lined up for you all so that you can communicate that to your members. But that's where you can come into play and be able to say, okay, I know that we've got people who are going to evacuate. We know that they've evacuated. So it's like Pastor Morgan said, you're not trying to find somebody, 16 hours into a disaster, and you're trying to figure out where that comes into play. The other way that we might be asking resources from you, and this was really important after the disaster, the tornado in Nashville, was to know, what resources you have in your community that can assist somewhere else. So we had a congregation in the Atlanta area over in Marietta who had a member who had availability to purchase tarps super cheap And so I forget how many they drove to Nashville, literally within days of the tornado. So it didn't affect the Marietta area, but because they had somebody in the congregation that had that resource and was able and willing to drive those things to the Nashville area where that stuff wasn't going to be available, that was really helpful. And so again, it just shows our partnership that when we work together, we are able to care for the least of these in the midst of a storm and provide that resource that's available. So as you develop your plan, knowing who's available in your site for that is really helpful and an important part of how we respond. All right. Carl, disinfectant means to kill germs or bacteria on a surface. The EPA does have a list of approved disinfecting products for COVID-19. The contact time is important depending on the product. Most require 10 minutes. So you need to disinfect all your high touch surface areas within your church, your pews, door handles, water fountains, etc. Before and in between services. I will say that a couple of our congregations that have multiple services, they on the following Wednesday do a deep clean, and then they close off their sanctuary and don't let anyone until the next Sunday. And then they have volunteers that come in after every service to do that. It's a lot easier if you remove all of those things that are not necessary for your service. So I love our hymnal, but your hymnal will not take to being wiped down with Lysol every single time it's being used. So you may have to move to a visitor-friendly bulletin that you can dispose of at the end of the service, ask people to take home and throw away, and then take those hymnals out of your sanctuary for that time being. You know, those lovely golf pencils that are in your pews need to go out. A lot of congregations, if you don't have a water bottle dispenser water fountain, are just turning off their water fountains during this time because you can't, you know, I don't know about you, but I've watched a lot of 2-year-olds drink out of a water fountain, and they don't just drink the water. They're licking everything there. So, you know, just turn them off. One of the big things, if you haven't used your facility for a long time, you need to make sure you're running your water in your building to make sure you're not getting any bacteria buildup in the pipes that can cause problems. Those are in our guidelines as well to make sure that that's happened. In terms of your HVAC system, you know, getting better quality filters for them. Now's the time just to do that. You know, sometimes we save money and buy the cheapest filter possible. Probably not the best thing to do that. Making sure your system's set on that you're pulling air from the outside in rather than recirculating into your building is important. If you're able to open windows, it's important. Adding box fans where you're just blowing the air around in your building that's not what they're talking about circulation, okay? Because all you're doing there is spreading the virus around. But if you have a window open and you have a box fan pulling in air from one side of the building, and you have a box fan that's blowing the air out, that is. Just putting up a box fan in your sanctuary and not having any windows open is just gonna circulate it faster. Singing is not recommended. So, you know, they're saying if you have someone who's standing behind like plexiglass and is 12 feet away, it's just a risky situation. You can record someone singing in the building earlier in the week and then projecting that is fine because you've had time for that. You know, it's like, you're just breathing heavy, and so the water droplets are going even farther. So people are getting really creative with singing. The Association of Lutheran Church Musicians, I think, just did a webinar on how to do virtual choirs where people record themselves at home, and then if you've got somebody who is really good at tech, can put it all together and make a choir happen that way. It doesn't mean you can't have music, right? I mean, yeah, there are other ways to do music. Or we've had people who've done where they've asked people just meditate on the words. You know, a lot of times people sing and they don't even really pay attention to the words. So maybe this is a time for us to meditate on what those words are, and maybe, you know, encourage your communications person to kind of talk about the history of that hymn, like where did that hymn come from, and people might learn, you know, where Silent Night came from. It actually came from the fact that somebody's organ died in the middle of the Christmas Eve, I think is what it was, and so he wrote a hymn that afternoon and played it on a guitar. And I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but the reality is we're probably looking at this pandemic expanding to the end of 2020. So if your COVID-19 task force and congregation has not begun to think about what does Advent and Christmas look like in the middle of a pandemic, now is the time to start to think about that. I'm not saying that people aren't going to gather for Christmas, but you need to think about how that can be done and be ready to pivot if your community it's not safe to do that. A lot of us reacted, and there's a difference between reacting and responding, right? I mean, reacting is like if I threw a punch at John right now, John would, you know, just probably, you know, react. He would maybe flinch or whatever in that process. If I told John, I'm going to hit you, he would prepare, right? He would respond. He would put his hand up or he would move away or whatever in that process. So that's what we're talking about with this, is we're asking congregations to not react to a storm, but to respond to a storm, be prepared for what's going to happen. So now we reacted to Easter because we didn't know what those first weeks of the pandemic were like. So we reacted. We can respond now. So maybe, you know, the COVID task force in your community reaches out to the children's ministry folks and says, okay, how can we do a children's nativity program on Zoom? You know, or do you have somebody that could record kids doing different parts and put it together and make a video? You know, how do we do, you know, a lot of churches do angel tree donations during Christmas. How can we do that if you can't go to the angel tree at your church and take the angel off the tree? You know, is there some kind of virtual bulletin board that you can claim a family to help during Thanksgiving or Christmas? What does this look like? You know, can we do an outdoor candlelight, you know, brief service on Christmas Eve where we're able to have physical distancing? If you're preparing for that now, it won't feel like the grief and loss of not being able to have Christmas. And then just, you know, how do we respond for those? We already know that mental health has been a big issue in the midst of this pandemic for people that live alone. So what does that look like? You know, God's Work Our Hands Sunday is coming up. Maybe we prepare now by doing Christmas cards that we can send out later to people who live alone, that every week during Advent, they get a special card or something. But what does that look like in the midst of this pandemic? You know, the one thing we have that the 1918 flu didn't have is we have this gift of technology. And so even in congregations where when we started this pandemic in March, said to me, we can't do technology, you know, they're learning to do that. And if we can resource you, Pastor Michael Jeanette is more than willing to meet with people to say, what do we need to make that happen? And I say this again, not because I want to be the bearer of bad news, but part of what you can help your congregation to look at is who won't be able to be present if you have a physical something. So thanks, Joe, for being with us. Sorry you have to go. But if you're starting to do physically gathering, making sure you're continuing something digital in some capacity so that people who do not feel comfortable can come to that. And again, this might go into 2021. So what does that look like? And there may be some people that, you know, you've reached because you've had a digital presence that you wouldn't have had prior to this. So what does that look like for your congregation? So maybe part of your COVID task force is people to look at technology that your congregation can work smarter rather than harder, and look at what are the options for live streaming when you do physically come back together in that process, and what kind of financial investment might you need to do in order to make that happen. So I'm really, really impressed with all of our congregations that we've gotten really creative with things, and I think are going to continue in that capacity. But you know, this is going to be this is our new reality for now. As Morgan said, we're those in the know are predicting that you know, new viruses will come, and how, you know, what are we learning from this one that can prepare us for the next one in that process. So hopefully, and I pray every night that there are some amazing researchers out there that are coming up with some kind of vaccine. And then I think we have an important role to also kind of communicate that with our members to make sure people are you know, doing that as well for the protection of everyone in that process. So that's kind of my update from COVID. I know that's a lot of information. I probably could have done 4 hours just on, you know, COVID stuff. You know, our guidelines are 20 some odd pages long for a reason. But you don't have, you know, just take one section of it and work through it at a time to determine what you need to do next in that process. Are there any questions about any of what we've discussed today? I hope your snacks were good. You know, that you had something healthy there too. So I do want to just say thank you to John, to Pastor Morgan, to Pastor Stacy, to Pastor Katie, to all of our disaster team that works so hard behind the scenes on stuff. You know, I would highly recommend if you either join VOAD or find out who in your area is on the VOAD. We were able to secure, because the disaster team is on those VOAD calls, 30 gallons of hand sanitizer and I think it was 9,000 masks just in Georgia that we were able to share with congregations that were doing food programs across mostly the metro Atlanta area. So there's those kind of resources that are coming out that through FEMA, through our government, that we can take advantage of to support our communities. So, you know, that's also a way to get information about those kind of resources is through VOAD. What questions do you have, if any? All right, who's scared to move forward? Anybody? Okay, look, nobody's raising their hand. Good job, Pastor Morgan, John. Do you guys feel like you have a place to start? Okay, and I want to say this is not, I mean, Pastor Morgan has all this information because she's been doing this for a really long time. John has all this information because he's been doing this for a really long time. Pastor Stacy's been doing this for a really long time. We pray and hope that your community never has to face what, like some of our brothers and sisters in Louisiana are cleaning up from today. But, you know, I think if you start with just the simple, you know, what do we need to do as a community to be prepared, you know, you'll see that one step will lead to the next step, and the next step will lead to the next step. And you'll develop a team and people that are ready if there is an issue. The snowpocalypse was not something anybody planned and would ever realize. But, you know, it made a lot of us who live in the metro Atlanta area start to think about what would happen if there was some reason why the whole city of Atlanta needed to evacuate at one time. And clearly that day showed us we were not prepared for that. So, you know, these are the things that we just have to think about in this day and age. And how do we resource people if they can't? And so what if, you know, all of a sudden you've got people walking into your church like John had that day to do that. So even if you don't have a food pantry, you know, do you need to keep a little kit just in case? Those are the things that you can start with, and then you move forward from there into whatever the next step would be. John, thanks for getting permission for those. So that means that he'll get them to me, and then I will get them all out to you. What you need to hear is we are here for you. And we're happy to, you know, as you get going, and if you have questions, I know Pastor Morgan's happy to answer those. John's happy to answer those. If they don't know the answers, they'll find somebody to answer those. I'm happy to take those and find out the answers because I'm still learning as well. You know, we are known not only because we have lots of disasters, but we're also known because we have really great volunteers who have lots of experience. So I guarantee you, if you have a question, somebody's got an answer for you. They just haven't done that. I will be happy to save the chat and email that to people. I'm doing that right now so that we get that when we're done. And this recording will go up on the website as soon as Pastor Michael Jeanette makes it look pretty. He'll do like a little slide at the beginning so people know what it is. It usually takes about 4 or 5 days before that gets there. So once that's up there, I'll email you all the links as well. All right. Really no questions? I'm like vamping here just in case so you guys had a, you know, like something came to you. Well, if not, again, thank you for everything, Pastor Morgan. Any parting wisdom?
All for your willingness to serve in this role. It is full.
And the other thing I'd say is, you know, if you know somebody at a neighboring church and they're not on this call, you know, you might say to them, hey, do you guys have a disaster team? You know, if you don't, you could sign up to be a disaster coordinator and maybe we could do some of this work together. So I'm thinking like Mary Kay, you've got Trinity and Lilburn right there, and Amazing Grace in Lawrenceville right there, and Rock of Ages right around the corner. You know, that for those of us that have neighbors, you know, we can do some of this work together. And if we need to help, you know, do a training for your local area, we're happy to do that as well. So, you know, you guys can help be our ambassadors to get more people. Our goal is to have every congregation to have a disaster coordinator. Even if all that disaster coordinator does is has everybody's phone number in the congregation and they have a plan to contact them in case of a disaster. You know, that in itself is important. So we want to help equip congregations to do that. Well, not seeing any questions, I'd like to close us with prayer and then send you on your ways so that you can go start work on that disaster plan. The Lord be with you. Gracious and loving God, we thank you that we get to be church together across these miles and that your Spirit connects us. We thank you for the wisdom and knowledge that Pastor Morgan and John and Pastor Stacy have shared with us this day. We thank you that we get to be your hands, bringing your grace and mercy in the midst of a disaster. And so, Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to serve your church. We pray, Lord, for those who on this day begin the cleanup, following Laura and Marco, that your Spirit would surround them, that they might know the love that you have for them, that in the midst of this disaster, they know it is not one that is created by you. And so we pray that the work of disaster relief across our nation will help to be that presence of you in the midst of it. So bless us as we go back to our congregations. Bless those that will work on these plans, that in the midst of all of it, they see this as a gift of using their baptismal calling to live out their ministry, the work that is needed in the midst of these disasters. So bless the work that they do. Bless our congregations in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis. Bless those that work in hospitals and in doctors' offices and in schools. Bless our first responders as they care for our community. And bless each of us as we live out our calling to be your body in our communities and across this country and the world. So on this day, fill us with your Spirit and guide the work that we do. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you all and have a blessed afternoon. Thanks for giving up your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.